Beneath this endless desert lies a secret that has been hidden for thousands of years. An ancient fortress buried beneath the sand waiting to reveal the forgotten story of a lost civilization. Who built it? Why was it abandoned? And what mysteries are still locked inside its walls? Before we uncover this incredible discovery, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden secrets of the ancient world. Now, let's begin the journey. By the time the vehicle leaves the last paved road behind the desert, has already swallowed almost every sign of the modern world. The horizon becomes a thin, wavering line beneath a white sky. Wind moves loose sand across the hard plain in pale sheets, erasing tire tracks almost as soon as they appear. There are no mountains to guide the eye, no towers, no trees, and no visible water. Only the immense emptiness of the Karakum Desert spreading across what is now Turkmenistan like a dry inland sea. Then almost imperceptibly the ground begins to rise. Low mounds emerge from the flatness, their edges softened by centuries of erosion. From a distance they look natural, no more remarkable than the countless ridges shaped by wind and dust. But as the light shifts, straight lines become visible. Corners appear where nature rarely makes them. Broken walls push through the soil. Beneath this silent desert plain lies the remains of a fortified city built more than 4,000 years ago. The place is known today as Gonur-Depe, a name often translated as the Grey Hill. It stands deep within the ancient delta of the Murghab River, far from the famous ruins of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley. For generations, the wider world knew almost nothing about it. Even specialists regarded much of Bronze Age Central Asia as a space between civilizations rather than the center of one. The old maps seemed to encourage that view. To the south lay the cities of Iran and Afghanistan. Farther west, the kingdoms of Mesopotamia. To the east, the settlements of the Indus world. Between them stretched deserts, mountain corridors, and steppe territory, commonly imagined as a route crossed by nomads, traders, and migrating peoples. Yet Gonur-Depe does not resemble a temporary camp or a modest frontier settlement. Its ruins reveal monumental buildings, defensive walls, carefully planned compounds, workshops, ritual areas, cemeteries, water systems, and evidence of long-distance connections reaching across much of the ancient world. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Standing among the exposed ruins, the first impression is not one of buried treasure or spectacular monuments. Gonur's power is quieter than that. Its walls are made largely from mud brick, the most practical building material in a land where stone and timber are scarce. After thousands of years, many structures have collapsed into rounded masses that resemble the earth from which they were formed. Rooms survive as outlines. Corridors end in drifts of sand. Towers that once rose above the settlement are now low platforms beneath the sun, yet the scale slowly becomes clear. What appears at first to be one ruined enclosure expands into a maze of walls and courtyards extending across dozens of hectares. The central fortified complex alone suggests enormous investment in labour planning and authority. Thousands of bricks had to be shaped, dried, carried, and set in place. Water and food had to support the builders. Someone had to organise the work. Someone had to decide where the gates would stand, which passages would be narrow, which rooms would be accessible, and which spaces would remain hidden behind multiple walls. The fortress does not sit on a dramatic hilltop. It occupies an open plain exposed beneath the sky. This makes its defensive design even more striking. Thick walls once enclosed the central buildings, reinforced by towers and protected by controlled entrances. Beyond them stood additional structures, residential areas, working spaces, and burial grounds. The arrangement suggests that Gona was not simply defended from outside attack. Its architecture also controlled movement within. Certain courtyards could be entered only through specific routes. Some chambers were separated from public areas by layers of walls. Storage spaces, ceremonial rooms, and elite quarters appear to have been organized with deliberate care. The fortress was therefore both a shield and a statement. It announced that the people inside possessed resources worth protecting and the power to command those beyond its gates. Modern excavation of the site is most closely associated with archaeologist Victor Sarianidi, whose teams began revealing Gona during the later 20th century. What they uncovered challenged older assumptions about the region. Gona belonged to a larger Bronze Age cultural world, now commonly called the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, or the Oxus civilization. Its settlements occupied parts of present-day Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and neighbouring regions. The name is modern. The people themselves left no clear written account identifying who they were or what they called their cities. Their language remains unknown. Their rulers are nameless. No surviving king list places Gona among the great powers of the age. Its walls speak but only indirectly, and archaeology must recover meaning from broken objects, buried bodies, traces of fire, animal bones, seeds, channels, and the changing layers of earth. That silence makes the fortress unusually compelling. In Egypt, rulers carved their names into stone. In Mesopotamia, scribes recorded taxes, battles, offerings, marriages, and complaints. At Gona, there is no comparable archive waiting to explain the ruins. The site contains seals and symbols, but no securely deciphered writing system that can narrate its history. Every interpretation begins with physical evidence, and the evidence remains incomplete. A room blackened by fire may be a shrine, a workshop, or a place used for several purposes across generations. A large building may be called a palace because of its scale and arrangement, but no inscription confirms that a king lived there. Objects placed in graves may reveal status, ritual, affection, fear, or beliefs about death, yet the exact meanings vanished with the mourners who arranged them. Even the word fortress invites caution. The walls are real, and their defensive appearance is difficult to ignore, but scholars still debate how much warfare shaped life at Gona. Fortifications can repel enemies, but they can also display prestige, regulate trade, protect valuable stores, or separate sacred and political spaces from ordinary neighbourhoods. No single explanation fully accounts for everything uncovered here. The settlement may have been a capital, a ceremonial centre, a royal residence, a fortified oasis town, or all of these at different times. Ancient cities rarely obey the neat categories created for them thousands of years later. What survives in the record suggests a community that had mastered the difficult art of creating permanence in an unstable landscape. This was not a city placed beside a dependable river like the Nile flowing within a narrow and predictable valley. The Murghab divided into shifting channels as it entered the desert. Water could bring life to one district and abandon it generations later. Fields, canals, and settlements depended on a delicate relationship between human planning and natural movement. Gona's walls may have looked immovable, but the city's true foundation was water, and water in this landscape never remained still. Today the fortress lies beneath relentless heat. Dust gathers in the corners of excavated rooms. Lizards cross thresholds once guarded by people whose names are lost. From the top of a ruined wall, the surrounding plain appears almost lifeless, making the city seem impossible. Yet the desert seen today is not the world its builders knew. The emptiness is the final layer of the mystery, not its beginning. To understand why thousands of people raised walls here, stored grain here, buried their dead here and built ceremonial spaces at the edge of a wilderness, the sand must be mentally stripped away. The dry channels must fill again. Vegetation must return to the plain. Herds, fields, smoke, voices, and moving water must occupy the horizon. Long before Gona became a grey hill, this buried fortress stood within a living oasis. The desert must first be imagined as water. Not an endless blue expanse, but a broad, unstable fan of rivers splitting and rejoining across the plain, carrying mountain meltwater northward from the highlands of Afghanistan. The Murghab does not flow through this landscape as a single obedient channel. As it leaves the foothills and enters the flatter country, it spreads outward, breaking into branches that shift across generations. Some channels deepen, others choke with sediment. Floodwater spills over low banks, deposits fertile silt, and then withdraws, leaving damp ground where reeds, grasses, and crops can grow. In the Bronze Age, this moving delta forms a green frontier pressed against the desert, a place where agriculture is possible, but never guaranteed. Gona rises because this fragile abundance exists, and because people learn how to hold it in place for a time. The change is difficult to picture from the ruins alone. Today the landscape around Gona appears bleached and exposed. In the 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE, parts of the Murghab Delta support dense belts of vegetation. Tamarisk and poplar grow along watercourses. Reeds fill shallow pools and marshes. Wild birds gather where channels widen. Herds graze on seasonal pasture beyond cultivated fields. The air carries insect smoke, damp earth, and the smell of animals. Villages stand on slightly raised ground above the floodplain, close enough to water for daily survival, but far enough from the lowest channels to avoid every minor overflow. The oasis does not resemble a garden extending without interruption to the horizon. It is a patchwork of green corridors surrounded by dry land, and those corridors are always vulnerable. The people who settle here do not merely discover a ready-made paradise. They create one through repeated labour. Water must be guided into fields. Channels must be cleared when they fill with silt. Banks must be reinforced. New canals must be cut when the river changes direction. The work is seasonal, communal, and unforgiving. A neglected canal can reduce a harvest. A breach can drown crops. A channel that shifts too far may leave an entire settlement beyond the reach of irrigation. These pressures shape the society long before monumental walls appear. Cooperation becomes essential, but so does authority. Someone must coordinate labour, decide which fields receive water, settle disputes, store grain, and organise repairs. Control of water gradually becomes control of survival. Archaeological surveys across the Murghab Delta reveal that settlements did not remain fixed forever. They moved as the river system moved. Clusters of communities appeared around active channels, flourished while water remained accessible, and declined when those channels migrated or dried. Gona belongs to one of the most important phases of this shifting occupation. Its location was not chosen randomly. It stood within a productive zone where irrigation, farming, herding, and exchange could support a large population. The city's later scale may give an impression of permanence, but beneath that confidence lies a landscape that demanded constant adjustment. The crops grown in this world include wheat and barley, staples already cultivated across much of Western and Central Asia. These grains can be stored, transported, taxed, and redistributed, making them essential not only to diet but to political power. Legumes and other plants likely add variety, while livestock provide meat, milk, hides, bone traction, and manure. Sheep and goats are particularly suited to the margins of the oasis, where cultivated land gives way to drier pasture. Cattle require more water but contribute strength and status. Horses, which later become central to the history of Central Asia, also appear in the wider cultural landscape, though their exact role at Ghana remains debated. The evidence remains incomplete, and animal bones do not always reveal whether an animal was raised for food transport ritual or several purposes during its life. This oasis is also a meeting place between different ways of living. Farmers depend on fixed canals and fields. Pastoral groups move herds through wider territories following seasonal pasture. Hunters exploit wetlands, desert edges, and riverine habitats. Craftspeople require clay fuel minerals, stone, and other materials not always available locally. Traders cross long distances between settlements and mountain regions. Rather than belonging to completely separate worlds, these groups interact constantly. They exchange animals, grain tools, ornaments, knowledge, and sometimes conflict. Gona eventually becomes powerful because it stands where these networks overlap. One lesser-known feature of the Murghab landscape is the sheer difficulty of reconstructing it. Ancient channels are not always obvious on the ground. Some are buried beneath sediment. Others survive only as faint lines visible from the air or through satellite imagery. Archaeologists combine excavation with geomorphology, soil study, and remote sensing to trace where water once flowed. The resulting maps show a delta alive with movement, not a single stable river bordered by permanent towns. This has changed the way the civilization is understood. The rise and decline of settlements cannot be explained only through kings' warfare or trade. The river itself acts almost like a historical force, opening opportunities in one generation and closing them in another. Yet environmental opportunity alone does not produce a city like Gona. Many communities live beside water without building massive compounds. The transformation requires population growth, stored, surplus specialized labor, and a social system capable of directing resources. As harvests become more reliable, not everyone must work full-time in the fields. Some people can shape pottery, cast metal, carve, stone, weave textiles, construct walls, tend animals, conduct rituals, or manage stores. This specialization creates wealth, but it also creates difference. Certain households gain more access to goods. Certain individuals control labor or distribution. Some graves begin to contain richer offerings than others. Architecture becomes more divided. The oasis supports not only life but hierarchy. There is an irony in this development. The more successful the settlements become, the more dependent they are on the system that sustains them. A small village can sometimes relocate when a channel shifts. A large centre filled with workshops, storehouses, temples, and elite compounds cannot move so easily. Its walls anchor it to one place. Its population demands continuous supply. Its fields and canals expand. The city grows stronger but also less flexible. Every new building makes the settlement more impressive and more vulnerable to disruption. For the moment, however, the water still comes. Boats or reed craft may move along some channels while pack animals travel overland between communities. Farmers work fields beyond the settlement walls. Herds return in dust at the end of the day. Kilns burn near working areas. Grain dries beneath the sun before being carried into storage. Children grow up knowing the sound of irrigation water moving through channels cut by earlier generations. The desert remains close visible beyond the green zone, but it has not yet won. From this engineered landscape, a new kind of settlement begins to emerge. Mud brick villages become larger and more organized. Boundaries harden. Central buildings grow more elaborate. The need to protect water, food, labor, and authority becomes inseparable from the need to display them. The oasis has created wealth, and wealth attracts both cooperation and competition. Soon the low settlements of the delta will be overshadowed by walls designed to endure rising above fields, whose survival depends on channels no wall can command forever. The first builders of the Murghab oasis do not begin with a city. They begin with repeated acts of survival so ordinary that they rarely leave dramatic traces, clearing a channel, repairing a bank, reshaping a field boundary, carrying mud, stacking grain, moving animals before floodwater rises. Over generations, these small decisions accumulate into a managed landscape. Villages become more permanent because the water system becomes more dependable. Fields expand because canals extend farther from the natural channels. Storage grows because harvests produce more than a household can consume immediately. What begins as adaptation gradually becomes organization, and organization creates the conditions for power. The people associated with the wider Oxus civilization are not isolated inventors appearing suddenly in an empty desert. Their settlements emerge from long traditions stretching across southern Central Asia and the Iranian plateau. Earlier farming communities had already learned to build with mud brick, grow cereals, keep livestock shape-painted pottery, and organize compact villages. Skills crops and architectural ideas move between regions over centuries. Some communities migrate. Others exchange materials and techniques. The result is not a single population marching into the Murghab under one leader, but a slow convergence of traditions in a landscape offering both opportunity and danger. As settlement increases, the oasis begins to function as a human-made ecosystem. Main canals divert water from active river branches. Smaller channels carry it towards separate fields. Earthen gates and temporary barriers regulate flow. Soil must be watched carefully, because irrigation brings not only fertility but risk. In hot, dry climates, water evaporates quickly, leaving salts behind. Poor drainage can slowly damage farmland. Overwatering can turn productive ground into marsh or crusted soil. Bronze Age farmers would not describe the process in modern scientific terms, but experience teaches them which fields are weakening and where new land must be opened. Their knowledge is practical, local, and carried through memory. The system demands timing. Water released too early may be wasted. Released too late, it may not save a crop. Families located near the head of a canal can take more than those farther down. Such tensions make some form of collective regulation unavoidable. It is impossible to know exactly how decisions were made. There may have been councils of household leaders, ritual authorities, hereditary chiefs, appointed overseers, or competing groups controlling different channels. Scholars still debate how centralized the earliest oasis communities were. Yet by the time Ghana reaches its height, architecture suggests that authority has become concentrated enough to command labor on a scale far beyond the household. Mud brick makes that labor visible. Each brick begins as a mixture of earth, water, and plant material pressed into shape and left to dry beneath the sun. One brick is simple. Tens of thousands require planning. Walls must be built thick enough to carry their own weight and survive seasonal weather. Foundations must be laid on suitable ground. Damaged surfaces require repair. Roofs need timber or reed supports materials that are harder to obtain than mud. Every major building, therefore, represents a network of workers, food suppliers, animal transport supervisors, and specialists. Monumental architecture is not merely an artistic achievement. It is stored labor made permanent. Ghana's rise likely depends on its ability to draw resources from surrounding settlements. Grain animals, reeds, clay, and fuel move inward. Finished objects, ritual authority, protection, and perhaps redistributed food move outward. The relationship may have been cooperative, coercive, or both. Ancient centers often survive through a mixture of shared benefit and unequal control. A large fortified settlement can offer safety during conflict storage, during shortage access to craft specialists and connection to wider trade. At the same time, it can demand labor tribute and obedience. The settlement's plan suggests that its growth is not entirely accidental. Streets, courtyards, walls, and compounds follow deliberate patterns. Buildings are grouped by function. Certain zones appear associated with production, others with resident storage, burial, or ceremony. This does not mean the whole city was designed at once. More likely it expanded in stages, with older structures rebuilt, absorbed, or replaced. Mud brick cities are constantly changing. Rooms are filled and raised. Doorways are blocked. Floors are resurfaced. Walls are thickened. A place inhabited for centuries becomes a layered record of decisions, although excavation can reveal only fragments of the full sequence. Outside the central enclosure, daily life would have been crowded and physically demanding. Potters worked near kilns where heat, smoke, and the danger of fire made distance from residences useful. Metalworkers needed furnaces, moulds, crucibles, and a reliable supply of fuel. Stone carvers handled imported materials too valuable to waste. Weavers and basket makers produced goods that rarely survive in the soil, leaving behind spindle whorls, impressions and tools rather than finished textiles. Food preparation filled courtyards with grinding stones, ovens, vessels, and discarded bone. Animals passed through narrow spaces, leaving dung that could become fuel. Water carriers moved constantly between channels, wells work areas, and homes. One surprising feature of these communities is the sophistication hidden behind materials that seemed simple. Mud brick can create imposing architecture. Clay vessels can be standardized for storage and distribution. Small seals can control access to goods or identify authority. Reeds can roof buildings, line baskets, form mats, and support plaster. Bone can become needles, handles, points, and ornaments. Nothing in the oasis is merely primitive because it is made from earth plants or animal remains. The civilization's complexity lies not in rare materials alone, but in how efficiently ordinary resources are organized. As Ghana grows, social distinctions sharpen. Some residences are larger. Some burials contain more elaborate goods. Certain individuals gain access to imported stones, metal objects, decorated vessels, and animals used in ceremonial display. Children may inherit status before they have had time to earn it, a sign that inequality is becoming embedded rather than temporary. Yet the exact structure of society remains uncertain. There is no surviving text naming kings, priests, merchants, farmers, or servants. Titles such as palace, temple, and elite are useful, but they are interpretations imposed on architecture whose original language is lost. Still, the direction is clear. The oasis is no longer a loose collection of villages linked only by water. It is becoming a political landscape. The channels connect fields, but also bind communities into systems of obligation. Storehouses preserve food, but also concentrate control. Workshops create wealth, but also depend on patrons and supply networks. Ritual spaces unite people, but may strengthen those who claim access to the sacred. By the time the central complex at Gonor begins to dominate the plain, the city is already the visible center of relationships extending far beyond its walls. The builders have transformed the delta into something that can support thousands. They have learned to turn mud into architecture, water into surplus, and surplus into authority. Yet prosperity carries a new problem. Grain stores attract thieves. Trade attracts rivals. Concentrated wealth creates fear of loss. Social hierarchy requires symbols that can be seen from a distance. The same hands that clear canals now shape thicker walls. Towers begin to rise above the fields, and the open oasis takes on the form of a guarded world. The walls rise slowly, course by course, from the same earth that feeds the fields beyond them. At first they may appear as simple boundaries separating one compound from another, but as Gonor grows, those boundaries become thicker, taller, and more deliberate. Towers project from the outer line, entrances narrow, corridors bend before reaching central spaces. the city begins to turn inward, protecting not only its people, but its stores, rituals, workshops, and authority. From the open plain, the effect would have been unmistakable. Where most of the oasis lay low beneath the horizon, Gonner presented a man-made elevation, a geometry of walls standing against the flatness of the desert edge. Mud brick does not create the illusion of permanence easily. It cracks under heat, softens under rain, erodes under wind, and requires constant repair. To maintain a large fortified complex, workers must return season after season to patch damaged surfaces and rebuild weakened sections. The walls seen by archaeologists are therefore not the product of a single building campaign. They are the result of repeated effort, a structure renewed by generations who believed the centre was worth preserving. Every repaired tower speaks of continued confidence in the city. Every thickened wall suggests that protection, display, or both remained important. The central enclosure appears to have been organised as more than a defensive shell. Its architecture channels movement. A person approaching from outside would not simply pass through a gate and enter an open square. Access seems to have been filtered through narrow passages and controlled spaces, forcing visitors to move along routes chosen by the builders. This is a common language of power in ancient architecture. Walls do not only keep enemies out, they decide who may enter, how quickly they may move, what they are permitted to see, and how close they may come to those at the centre. The towers reinforce that message. Some may have served practical defensive functions, allowing guards to observe the approaches and protect vulnerable sections of wall. Others may have been partly symbolic, emphasizing scale and authority in a landscape where few structures rose high. Their exact height is unknown because the upper courses have long since collapsed. Yet even low surviving foundations reveal a complex designed to be seen. Gonner's central buildings would have dominated the surrounding settlement, just as its leaders likely dominated the people and resources gathered around them. Whether the city faced frequent attack remains uncertain. Archaeologists have found evidence of weapons defensive planning and episodes of destruction, but the record does not clearly reveal a long history of sieges. No single enemy can be identified. The walls may have guarded against rival oasis communities, mobile pastoral groups, raiders from the steppe, or internal unrest. They may also have protected valuable goods from theft during periods of shortage. Scholars still debate how much warfare shaped the Oxus civilization, and the absence of detailed written records makes the question difficult to settle. One possibility is that the walls guarded the city's surplus. Grain stored within a central enclosure could sustain workers' support ceremonies, reward loyal followers, and carry the population through a failed harvest. In a dry environment, stored food becomes political insurance. To control it is to control time itself, extending survival beyond the immediate season. Large storerooms and carefully arranged rooms within the fortress suggest that accumulation mattered. Yet storage also creates vulnerability. A village with little surplus offers limited reward to attackers. A city filled with grain, metal, livestock, and imported goods becomes a target. The gates therefore become crucial. They regulate the movement of people and materials between the fortress and the wider oasis. Farmers may arrive with grain, herdsmen bring animals, craftspeople carry finished objects, traders enter with stone metal shells or unfamiliar goods from distant regions. Workers leave for fields and canals, messengers travel between settlements. Each movement passes through a controlled threshold. A gate is both an opening and a point of judgment, the place where the protected world meets the uncertain landscape beyond. Inside space appears increasingly divided according to rank and function. The central compound is not a democratic gathering place in which all residents move freely. Some routes lead toward administrative or ceremonial zones, Others serve storerooms or working areas. Certain rooms may have been accessible only to elites, officials, or ritual specialists. Even without written laws, architecture can enforce hierarchy. A person who must stop at an outer courtyard understands their position. A person permitted through several layers of walls understands theirs as well. The fortress also shapes the daily psychology of its inhabitants. People living within or near monumental walls experience them as part of ordinary life. Children grow up beneath towers built before their birth. Workers pass through gates guarded by officials. Ceremonies take place in spaces whose scale exceeds that of private homes. The city's political order becomes physical and familiar, embedded in routes walked every day. Authority is no longer only a personal relationship with a leader. It is built into the street's doors, courtyards, and walls. There is also a quieter form of defense at work. Thick mud brick walls help regulate temperature, keeping interiors cooler during the hottest part of the day and warmer during cold desert nights. Narrow passages can provide shade. Enclosed courtyards reduce wind. The architecture responds to climate as much as to conflict. What looks like a fortress from above may have served multiple purposes at ground level, combining security, environmental control, storage, ceremony, and political display. No single explanation fully accounts for its design. The surrounding plain would have made the fortress visible from a considerable distance. Travelers approaching along a canal or track would first see the upper walls and towers, then the outer settlement fields, smoke and animals. The city announced itself long before a visitor reached its gates. This mattered in a world where reputation could be as useful as force. A large wall suggested that the inhabitants were numerous, organized, and difficult to challenge. It also suggested wealth. Fortifications can discourage attack, but they can also proclaim that something valuable lies within. That contradiction sits at the heart of Gonur. The walls protect the center while revealing its importance. They create security while fixing the city more firmly to one place. They separate the elite from the wider population while depending on that population's labor. They stand as evidence of strength, but also of anxiety. People do not invest enormous effort in fortification unless they believe there is something to lose. Beyond the walls, life continues in the fields and workshops that make the fortress possible. Water still moves through canals. Grain still ripens beneath the sun. Herds graze along the green margins. Yet within the central enclosure, the city's most guarded spaces take shape. Behind multiple walls lie halls, storerooms, courtyards, and private chambers arranged according to a logic only partly recovered. The fortress has become a shell around a deeper mystery, and to understand what it protects, the path must pass through the gate and into the heart of Gonur. Passing through the heavily controlled entrances of Gonur's central fortress, the atmosphere changes almost immediately. The noise of daily labor that fills the outer settlement, animals grinding stones, pottery kilns and irrigation work would likely have faded behind thick mud brick walls. Inside movement appears more deliberate. Courtyards open unexpectedly after narrow corridors. Buildings cluster around enclosed spaces rather than broad public squares. The architecture encourages order rather than spontaneity. Even after 4,000 years of collapse and erosion, archaeologists can still recognize that this was not simply the crowded center of an ordinary town. It was a carefully organized complex where political authority, economic control, and ceremonial life were closely intertwined. One of the striking characteristics of the central enclosure is its layered arrangement. Instead of one enormous building dominating everything around it, the fortress contains multiple compounds, each separated by walls and connected through controlled passages. This layout suggests that different activities took place within closely guarded zones. Some areas appear to have been dedicated to storage, others to residence, while still others contain architectural features that many archaeologists interpret as ceremonial or administrative. Because no written documents survive, certainty remains impossible. A room filled with large ceramic jars may indicate food storage, redistribution of supplies, or preparation for rituals. A spacious hall may have hosted political gatherings, religious ceremonies, or elite feasts. The evidence survives, but its original language has disappeared. The largest structures occupy the most protected parts of the enclosure. Their thick walls and carefully planned rooms imply that only selected individuals entered them regularly. These buildings are often described as palaces, yet that modern word should be used cautiously. There is no inscription naming a king, no carved throne, and no royal archive waiting beneath the floors. Still, the concentration of resources and the architectural prominence strongly suggest that the people directing Gona's affairs lived or worked near the city's heart. Whether they ruled as hereditary monarchs, priestly elites, or councils of powerful families remains one of the enduring questions surrounding the Oxus civilization. Storage plays an especially important role within the fortress. Archaeologists have uncovered numerous large vessels, magazines, and rooms suitable for preserving agricultural products. In a landscape where harvest depended entirely upon carefully managed irrigation, accumulated grain represented security, wealth, and influence. Surplus could sustain workers during construction projects, support specialized craftsmen, provide offerings during ceremonies, and protect the population during years of poor harvest. Whoever supervised these stores possessed considerable authority. Control over food often becomes the foundation of political power, long before coins or written taxation systems appear. The design of the storage areas also reflects remarkable foresight. Grain must remain dry, protected from rodents, insects, and sudden moisture. Large ceramic containers, elevated floors, carefully sealed rooms, and restricted access all reduce the risk of spoilage or theft. Such practical details rarely attract public attention, compared with monumental walls or luxurious grave goods, yet they reveal an equally impressive achievement. A civilization capable of feeding thousands through uncertain environmental conditions requires careful planning every season, not merely impressive construction during prosperous years. Residential areas inside the enclosure differ noticeably from ordinary domestic spaces found elsewhere in the settlement. Larger rooms, more elaborate layouts, and evidence of repeated rebuilding indicate long-term occupation by individuals of elevated status. These compounds may have housed administrators, ritual specialists, senior families, or those responsible for managing the surrounding oasis. Life inside these walls was almost certainly more comfortable than in the smaller houses beyond the central compound, but comfort came with responsibility. Decisions concerning irrigation, labor storage, exchange, and ceremony may all have been made within these rooms, yet the fortress was never entirely separated from the people outside. Every decision made within its walls ultimately depended upon farmers cultivating distant fields, herders tending livestock, artisans producing tools, and laborers maintaining canals. The central enclosure functioned because the wider oasis functioned. This relationship between centre and countryside appears repeatedly throughout ancient history. Monumental cities often seem independent when viewed through their architecture, but they remain deeply dependent upon landscapes extending far beyond their visible limits. Some of the most intriguing discoveries inside Gona involve carefully designed courtyards. Open spaces surrounded by buildings provided light ventilation, and gathering places sheltered from the harsh desert winds. Courtyards also served practical purposes. Goods could be unloaded, grain-dried animals temporarily held, or communal activities conducted within protected surroundings. At the same time, they possess symbolic importance. Moving from one enclosed courtyard to another created a sequence of increasingly restricted spaces, subtly reinforcing social hierarchy. Each additional wall crossed represented another level of privilege or authority. Water itself entered the fortress in carefully controlled ways. Archaeologists have identified wells channels and reservoirs associated with different parts of the complex. Reliable access to water inside fortified walls would have been essential during periods of conflict or environmental stress. More importantly, water possessed symbolic value in a civilization whose entire existence depended upon mastering an unpredictable river system. Maintaining clean, accessible supplies within ceremonial and administrative areas reinforced both practical resilience and ideological authority. Excavations have also revealed evidence of workshops operating surprisingly close to elite spaces. Metal objects, fine ceramics, stone vessel seals and decorative materials demonstrate that highly skilled craftsmen worked under the protection of the central compound. This arrangement suggests that valuable production remained closely supervised. Precious materials such as lapis lazuli, turquoise, carnelian bronze and imported stone represented significant investments. Allowing them to circulate without oversight would have increased the risk of theft or loss. Housing specialized artisans near the administrative core ensured both security and quality control. Despite this careful organization, everyday life inside the fortress was probably far less glamorous than modern imagination often suggests. Dust accumulated constantly. Mud brick surfaces required regular maintenance. Roofs demanded repair after seasonal weather. Food had to be prepared, waste removed, animals managed, and water carried. Officials responsible for directing irrigation or supervising labor likely spent much of their time solving practical problems rather than conducting grand ceremonies. The success of the city rested upon thousands of ordinary decisions repeated day after day. One lesser-known aspect of Ghana's architecture is how adaptable it proved over centuries of occupation. Rooms were frequently remodeled. Doorways were sealed while new entrances appeared elsewhere. Floors rose gradually as damaged surfaces were covered by fresh layers of plaster and debris. Entire buildings changed function as the needs of the community evolved. Rather than preserving an ideal plan forever, the inhabitants continuously reshaped their city. The fortress remained recognizable, but was never static. As archaeologists remove layer after layer of accumulated earth, they encounter not one frozen moment but generations of adjustment. Each rebuilding episode reflects changing priorities, growing experience and responses to new challenges. Some modifications may indicate expanding authority. Others could reflect environmental pressures or shifting ritual practices. No single explanation fully accounts for every alteration, yet together they reveal a society capable of adapting while maintaining remarkable continuity. Behind these walls, however, practical administration was only one part of the city's identity. Beyond the storerooms and residential compounds lay spaces unlike ordinary houses or workshops. Ash deposits, carefully arranged installations, unusual vessels, and evidence of repeated ceremonial activity hint at a sacred dimension woven deeply into the fortress itself. Here, fire, water, and ritual may have been brought together in ways that continue to fascinate archaeologists, even as scholars debate exactly what those ceremonies meant. The sacred spaces of Ghana do not announce themselves with towering statues or carved inscriptions. They survive as quieter evidence platforms darkened by repeated burning channels that carried liquids, carefully placed vessels, unusual rooms, layers of ash, and traces of plants preserved in the soil. These remains are fragmentary, but together they suggest that ritual occupied an important place within the fortified centre. fire and water. The two forces most essential to life in the oasis appear to have been treated not only as practical resources, but as substances surrounded by rules, preparation and ceremony. Several buildings at Goner have been interpreted as temples or ritual compounds, partly because their layouts differ from ordinary houses and workshops. Some contain hearths or fire installations positioned with unusual care. Others include basins, narrow channels, and spaces where liquids may have been prepared or poured. Access appears restricted in certain areas, implying that not everyone could enter freely. Yet the word temple can create a false sense of certainty. No surviving text identifies a deity, names a priesthood, or explains what took place in these rooms. Scholars still debate whether every structure labelled ceremonial truly served a religious function, and some may have combined ritual, domestic and administrative uses. Fire leaves some of the clearest traces. Hearths are common in ancient settlements, but the installations within Goner's central compound sometimes appear too formal or carefully arranged to be explained by ordinary cooking alone. Repeated burning created thick ash deposits. In certain spaces, flames may have been maintained for long periods or rekindled according to specific routines. Fire could transform food-hardened pottery, melt metal, provide warmth, repel darkness, and consume offerings. It was both useful and dangerous, a force that demanded control. In a society dependent upon mud brick buildings and dry plant material, uncontrolled fire could destroy entire compounds. A flame deliberately preserved within a protected room would therefore carry practical as well as symbolic weight. Water possessed equal importance. Every field animal, household and workshop depended upon it, but clean water was never unlimited. Channels within the central complex may have supplied daily needs, supported craft production, or served ceremonial washing and preparation. Some installations have been interpreted as evidence that liquids were filtered, mixed, or separated. This has encouraged comparisons with later religious traditions of Iran and South Asia, where purity firewater and ritual drinks hold major significance. Such comparisons are tempting, especially because Central Asia later becomes a crossroads of Indo-Iranian languages and religious ideas. But they must be handled carefully. Similar practices can emerge independently, and a Bronze Age installation cannot be assigned to a later faith merely because it appears familiar. The most famous and controversial interpretation involves a sacred drink. Excavators recovered residues and plant remains from vessels and installations that were proposed as evidence for a ritual beverage sometimes linked to the substances later known as halma in Iranian tradition, and soma in early Indian texts. Both later traditions describe a prepared plant drink associated with ritual power, altered state's vitality, and communion with the sacred. The possibility that Goner preserves an early form of such a practice is deeply intriguing. It would place the fortress within the distant background of beliefs later recorded far beyond the Murghab Delta. The evidence, however, remains disputed. Early claims identified combinations of plants that may have included ephedra cannabis and poppy substances capable of medicinal or psychoactive effects. Later researchers questioned whether all the botanical identifications were secure, whether contamination had occurred, and whether the vessels truly belonged to ritual preparation rather than ordinary food or medicine. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the installations. It is possible that specialized drinks were prepared at Goner, but their ingredients' purpose and meaning cannot be reconstructed with confidence. Even without proving the existence of a sacred intoxicant, the vessels themselves reveal deliberate activity. Some are shaped for pouring. Others could have been used for grinding, straining, storing, or mixing. Large jars might hold fermented liquids, oils, water, or grain. Smaller containers may have carried concentrated substances. Filters or perforated objects suggest separation of solids from liquids, although similar tools can serve multiple purposes. Archaeology often encounters this problem. The same object can belong to cooking healing ceremony or craft depending upon context. At Gonur, the clustering of unusual vessels near fire installations strengthens the ritual interpretation but does not settle it. The preparation of a ceremonial drink would have required knowledge controlled by particular people. Plants must be gathered at the right season, dried or processed, measured and mixed. Some ingredients may have come from beyond the immediate oasis, creating links between ritual and long-distance exchange. The resulting substance could be offered to fire, poured onto the ground, consumed by selected participants, or distributed during communal ceremonies. Each possibility carries different implications. A drink shared widely could strengthen group identity. A drink reserved for elites or specialists could reinforce hierarchy. One administered during funerals or healing ceremonies might connect the living, the dead, and the unseen world. What survives in the record suggests that ritual at Gona was closely tied to material transformation. Grain becomes bread or beer. Plants become medicine or ceremonial liquid. Animals become food offerings and symbols of wealth. Clay becomes vessels, or becomes metal. Fire changes one state into another, while water carries, cleanses, dissolves and revives. These processes would have appeared both ordinary and mysterious. Bronze Age people understood them through practical experience, but they may also have interpreted them through stories, inherited rules, and sacred obligations now completely lost. Animal remains found in ceremonial context deepen the mystery. Dogs, horses, sheep, cattle, and other animals appear in burials and special deposits across the site. Some were sacrificed or deliberately placed rather than discarded as food waste. The selection of species may reflect status, protection, transport, fertility, or beliefs concerning passage between worlds. Dogs are especially interesting because they later hold symbolic roles in several Indo-Iranian traditions, sometimes connected with guarding boundaries or accompanying the dead. Yet again, later parallels cannot be projected backward as proof. They offer possibilities, not answers. The people conducting rituals within Gona's compounds may have worn distinctive clothing, used particular vessels, or followed precise sequences of movement. None of this survives clearly. Textiles decay. Spoken words vanish immediately. Gestures leave no direct trace. Archaeologists are left with architecture and residue the stage after the performance has ended. A burned platform shows that fire was used, but not the prayer, song, silence, fear, or expectation surrounding it. Still, the placement of ritual spaces near the center of the fortress is significant. Sacred activity was not pushed to the margins. It stood close to storage authority and elite residence. This suggests that political and religious power may have supported one another. Those who controlled grain and water may also have controlled ceremonies that explained why order should be maintained. In a landscape where the river could shift and harvests could fail, ritual offered a way to confront uncertainty. It could not command the Murgab, but it could give meaning to dependence upon it. The fires eventually went cold. Ash settled beneath collapsing roofs. Vessels broke and disappeared beneath mud brick debris. Yet the ceremonial compounds remained protected by the same walls that guarded the city's wealth. Nearby, another form of evidence waited in deeper silence. Beneath the fortress and beyond its central buildings, the people of Gonur placed their dead with objects, animals, vehicles, and careful arrangements that reveal a society even more unequal, elaborate and mysterious than the architecture above. The dead of Gonur were not simply removed from the world of the living. They were placed within carefully prepared spaces surrounded by objects, animals, food, ornaments, and signs of ritual attention. Some graves are modest, containing little beyond the body and a few personal possessions. Others are far more elaborate, built as chambers or underground structures, and filled with goods that required wealth, labour, and planning. The contrast is unmistakable. In death as in life, the society of Gonor was divided by rank. The cemeteries surrounding the settlement preserve thousands of individual decisions. A vessel placed beside the hand, a necklace arranged across the chest, an animal laid near the entrance, or a weapon positioned beside the body all reflect choices made by survivors. These actions were not random. They belonged to beliefs about identity, memory, status, protection, and whatever existence was imagined beyond death. Yet no funerary text explains those beliefs. Archaeologists see the arrangement after the mourners have left, but the words spoken over the grave are gone. Many bodies were buried in a flexed position with knees drawn inward, although practices vary across the site and through time. The dead may have been wrapped in textiles, mats, or hides that have since decayed. Some graves were reopened, perhaps for additional burials, ritual visits, or the removal of objects. Others were disturbed by looting in antiquity. The result is a record both rich and damaged. What survives in the record suggests a highly structured funerary tradition, but no single burial can represent the entire population. The wealthiest tombs are among the most dramatic discoveries at Gonor. They contain fine ceramics, metal vessels, stone objects, ornaments of gold, silver, carnelian, turquoise, and lapis lazuli, and carefully crafted personal items. Many of these materials were not locally available. Their presence reveals that the individuals buried with them were connected to trade networks extending hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. A bead may be tiny, but its journey could cross mountains, deserts, workshops, and several cultural boundaries before reaching the grave. Some elite burials include wheeled vehicles or parts of them. Wooden components rarely survive well, but wheel impressions, metal fittings, animal remains, and grave layouts can preserve enough evidence to suggest carts or wagons. These vehicles were not the light war chariots made famous in later centuries. They were heavier constructions likely associated with transport, prestige ceremony, or the symbolic journey of the dead. Their inclusion in graves demanded enormous resources. A vehicle required timber, skilled carpentry, animal power, and maintenance. To bury one was to remove a valuable object from use, a gesture possible only for families or institutions capable of absorbing the loss. Animals also entered the grave. Horses, cattle, sheep, goats, dogs, and other species have been found in deliberate funerary contexts. Some were complete sacrifices, others were represented by selected parts. Their placement may have served as food for the dead symbols of rank companions, for a journey guardians, or offerings to unseen powers. The meaning likely differed by species and context. Scholars still debate the interpretation, especially when later religious traditions seem to offer parallels. Such comparisons are suggestive, but they cannot recover the exact beliefs of Gonor. Dogs are among the most intriguing examples. They appear in special burials and ceremonial deposits, sometimes in arrangements that indicate deliberate treatment, rather than ordinary disposal. In later Iranian traditions, dogs can hold protective and funerary significance, but it would be unsafe to assume the same system existed unchanged more than 1,000 years earlier. What can be said with greater confidence is that dogs at Gonor were not viewed only as working animals. In at least some contexts, they possess symbolic importance. The treatment of horses is equally revealing. Horse remains have attracted attention because of the later importance of mounted pastoralism and chariot warfare across Eurasia. At Gonor, however, the role of the horse is difficult to define. Some animals may have been used for traction, prestige exchange, or ritual rather than riding. The archaeological record does not support simple claims that the city was dominated by horse warriors. Instead, the evidence points to a more complex transition, in which horses were becoming socially significant before their later military role was fully developed. One of the most unsettling discoveries in the cemeteries is evidence that some animals and possibly some humans were sacrificed as part of elite funerals. Determining sacrifice is difficult. A body found near another does not automatically indicate ritual killing. Cause of death may not survive in the bones, and disturbed graves can create misleading arrangements. Yet certain deposits appear too deliberate to be accidental. Servants, dependents, captives, or members of a ritual group may have accompanied high-status individuals into burial, although the evidence remains incomplete and interpretations must remain cautious. These graves reveal more than belief. They expose the economic structure of the city. Wealth buried with the dead was wealth removed from circulation. Metal vessels could be melted and reused. Stone ornaments could be inherited. Animals could breed work or feed the living. Wagons could transport goods. To place such resources underground was a public declaration that the deceased or the group controlling the funeral possessed enough surplus to sacrifice valuable property. Funerals therefore became performances of power. The display may have begun before burial. A body could be washed, dressed, adorned, and presented for mourning. Animals might be led in procession. Food and drink could be consumed by participants or deposited in the tomb. Fires may have burned near the grave. Goods may have been displayed before being sealed away. The cemetery was not necessarily a silent place. During ceremonies, it may have filled with smoke movement, animals, and crowds. Yet the final act was enclosure. Mud, brick, and earth closed the tomb, separating the dead from the living while preserving social memory beneath the ground. Children's graves show that status could be inherited. Some young individuals were buried with objects too rich to reflect personal achievement. They had not lived long enough to become administrators, warriors, merchants, or ritual leaders. Their funerary wealth indicates that rank belonged to family or lineage. Inequality had become embedded in birth. This is a crucial sign of a mature hierarchical society, one in which power did not depend only on temporary leadership, but could pass across generations. At the same time, modest graves remind us that most inhabitants did not receive such treatment. Farmers, labourers, herders, craft workers, and servants may have been buried with few goods or in ways more vulnerable to destruction. Archaeology naturally draws attention to exceptional tombs because they preserve spectacular objects, but those tombs represent a narrow part of the population. The fortress was built and sustained by many people whose names and possessions barely survive. Even elite graves have not escaped time. Roofs collapsed, mud brick chambers filled with soil. Looters entered some tombs long before modern excavation. Metal corroded, wood, cloth, leather, and food vanished. What archaeologists recover is only a fraction of the original funeral. The most important elements may have been songs, gestures, and stories that left no physical trace. Still, the cemeteries make one fact clear. Ghana was not merely a settlement trying to survive at the edge of the desert. It was a society confident enough to invest deeply in memory. Its people believed that rank, identity, and obligation extended beyond the moment of death. They buried imported wealth, sacrificed animals, and constructed tombs beneath the same landscape they had transformed through canals and walls. And those imported objects lead outward. A blue stone from distant mountains, a seal carved in an unfamiliar style, a vessel shaped according to foreign traditions, each reveals that Ghana was connected to a much larger world. The dead carried those connections into their graves, but the living depended upon them in workshops, markets, and journeys extending far beyond the oasis. The objects buried with Goner's dead did not appear by accident, and many could not have been made from materials found anywhere near the Murghab oasis. Their presence points toward a wider world of workshops, caravans, mountain routes, river valleys, and distant settlements linked by exchange. Goner may have stood deep within a desert plain, but it was not isolated. Its craftsmen worked with materials that had already travelled extraordinary distances, transforming imported stone, metal, shell, and pigment into objects that carried both practical value and social meaning. The city's metalworkers occupied a particularly important place in this system. Bronze production required copper often mixed with tin or other elements to create harder and more useful alloys. Neither material was equally available across Central Asia, and obtaining them demanded access to mining regions and trade networks. Ore or finished ingots had to be transported over difficult terrain before reaching the oasis. Once there, metalworkers used furnaces, crucibles, moulds, hammers, and carefully controlled heat to produce tools, weapons, vessels, ornaments, and fittings. The process involved specialized knowledge that could not be improvised easily. A failed casting wasted precious material. A successful one converted distant geology into local power. Archaeologists have recovered blades, points, pins, mirrors, vessels, and decorative pieces from Goner and related sites. Some objects were designed for everyday use, but others were clearly prestige goods. A metal vessel required more labour and rarer resources than a ceramic one. A carefully polished mirror could signal rank. A decorated weapon might function as both tool and symbol displayed during ceremony or burial. The distinction between practical and ceremonial use was not always sharp. In a hierarchical society, even useful objects could communicate status through material finish and craftsmanship. Pottery was more common but no less essential. Ceramic production supplied household storerooms, workshops, and ritual spaces with vessels of many sizes. Large jars preserved grain liquids and other goods. Bowls and cups served food and drink. Specialized containers may have been used for oils, medicine, pigments, or ceremonial mixtures. Potters had to select and prepare clay, remove impurities, shape vessels, dry them carefully, and fire them at temperatures high enough to strengthen the walls without causing cracks. Standardized forms suggest repeated production, and shared conventions, possibly under some degree of central supervision. The kilns themselves demanded fuel, another resource that had to be managed in a landscape where large timber was limited. Reeds, brush, dung, and imported wood may all have contributed to firing pottery and heating furnaces. The need for fuel linked craft production to the wider ecology of the oasis. Every workshop depended on the same fields, animals, and riverine vegetation that sustained households. A rise in production could therefore create pressure far beyond the workshop walls. Stone carvers faced a different challenge. The Murghab plain offered clay in abundance, but many decorative stones came from distant sources. Lapis lazuli, prized for its deep blue colour, likely originated in the mountains of northeastern Afghanistan. Carnelian and other stones may have arrived through routes connecting Central Asia with the Iranian plateau and the Indus region. Turquoise, chlorite, and various soft stones were shaped into beads, seals, vessels, inlays, and amulets. Some objects were tiny, yet each required careful drilling and polishing with tools far less efficient than modern equipment. The presence of lapis lazuli is especially revealing. For ancient elites from Egypt to Mesopotamia, the stone's intense blue colour carried extraordinary prestige. Its main known sources lay far to the east, making Central Asia a crucial zone in the movement of this material. Goner may have functioned as a point where raw stone partly worked pieces and finished ornaments changed hands. This does not mean a single merchant travelled directly from the Murghab to every distant kingdom. More often, goods moved in stages through networks of communities, each adding value, knowledge, or risk. Seals provide some of the clearest evidence of administration and cultural exchange. Small carved seals could be pressed into clay to mark containers, doors, bundles, or transactions. Their designs include geometric forms, animals, and complex scenes. Some resemble styles found in neighbouring regions, while others appear distinctively local. A seal could identify an individual household, office, workshop, or institution, but without written labels, its exact function remains uncertain. What survives in the records suggests that goods and access were controlled, and that visual symbols played a role in that control. The artisans who made these objects were probably not all equal. Some may have worked independently within households, others may have served elite patrons or operated under the supervision of administrators inside the central complex. Highly skilled specialists could possess valued knowledge yet still remain dependent upon those controlling raw materials. A metal worker without copper cannot work. A stone carver without imported stone has little to carve. By concentrating supplies, the fortress could concentrate production as well. Textile production was likely among the largest industries in the city, although it is also one of the least visible archaeologically. Cloth decays quickly, especially compared with ceramic or stone. Spindle whorls, loom, weights, needles, and impressions provide indirect evidence of spinning and weaving. Wool from sheep may have been the principal fibre, supplemented by plant materials where available. Producing textiles required enormous time. Animals had to be managed, fibres cleaned, and spun threads dyed and cloth woven. Fine fabric could serve as clothing trade material, tribute wrapping for the dead, or decoration within elite buildings. The colours and patterns of Goner's textiles are largely lost. Yet even plain cloth represented accumulated labour and could be highly valuable. A finely woven garment might communicate status just as clearly as gold or stone. Ceremonial clothing could distinguish officials, priests, or members of elite families. Because textiles rarely survive modern reconstructions of Bronze Age life, often appear more colourless than the past itself probably was. Bone shell wood and reeds fill the spaces between more prestigious materials. Bone became awls, handles, pins, gaming pieces, and ornaments. Shells, some transported from distant waters, became beads or decorative inlays. Wood was used for doors, roofs, vehicles, containers, and tools despite its scarcity. Reeds formed mats, baskets, roofing, and screens. The civilization's material world was therefore far richer than the surviving ruins suggest. Most of it has vanished, leaving mud, brick, pottery, stone, and metal to stand in for an entire lost environment of cloth, wood, leather, fibre, and colour. Goner's workshops also reveal that the city was not simply consuming foreign goods. Its artisans adapted imported materials to local styles and produced objects that could travel outward again. The oasis was not a passive stop between greater civilizations. It was a centre of transformation where influences from several regions were reworked into something distinctive. Scholars still debate how independent the Oxus civilization was from its neighbours, but the evidence does not support the old image of Central Asia as an empty corridor. Trade brought more than materials. It carried techniques, symbols, stories, foods, rituals, and people. A new vessel shape might arrive with a migrant potter. A seal design could be copied from a foreign merchant. A method of alloying metal might spread through craftsmen moving between courts. Even small objects could carry unfamiliar ideas into the fortress. By the height of Goner's prosperity, its gates opened onto a world far larger than the oasis. Traders approached with pack animals. Craftsmen handled stones from distant mountains. Administrators marked goods with seals. Elite families displayed objects whose materials announced connections beyond the desert. Yet every foreign object also raised a deeper question. Were these goods carried by temporary visitors, exchanged through long chains, or brought by people who settled permanently within the city? The workshops reveal connection, but the cemeteries and houses begin to suggest something more complicated. Goner may have been home not to one isolated people, but to a population shaped by repeated arrivals from beyond its walls. The people arriving at Goner did not all come for the same reason. Some followed trade routes across the mountains and deserts carrying raw materials, finished goods and news from distant settlements. Others may have come as craftsmen, herders, marriage partners, ritual specialists, labourers, captives or refugees driven from failing communities. The fortress stood at the centre of an oasis, rich enough to attract outsiders, and its population likely reflected that pull. The city's walls created the impression of a single organised society, but the people living within and around them may have carried very different histories. Archaeologists search for these differences in burials, pottery styles, bodily remains, and the chemical signatures preserved in teeth and bones. Human movement rarely leaves a simple label. A foreign object does not prove that its owner was foreign, and an unfamiliar burial custom does not automatically identify an immigrant. Goods can travel without people, while people can move without bringing obvious possessions. Yet when several kinds of evidence point in the same direction, a more complex picture begins to emerge. Some graves at Goner differ from local patterns in the treatment of the body, the shape of the tomb, or the objects placed inside. These variations may represent families maintaining traditions brought from elsewhere. They may also reflect social rank, religious identity, occupation, or changes through time. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the diversity. Still, the cemeteries do not look like the product of a perfectly uniform population. They suggest a city where different customs met, overlapped, and gradually changed one another. Pottery offers another clue. Most vessels belong to recognizable local traditions, but certain shapes, decorations, and manufacturing techniques resemble those found in neighboring regions. A foreign-style pot might have been imported, copied by a local craftsman, or made by a migrant potter who settled in the oasis. Each possibility tells a different story. Imported vessels suggest exchange. Local imitations suggest admiration or adaptation. Migrant craftsmen suggest that technical knowledge moved through human lives rather than through objects alone. The same uncertainty surrounds seals and ornaments. Some designs resemble imagery from the Iranian plateau, Mesopotamia, the Indus world, or the steppe. Animals appear in unfamiliar combinations. Geometric patterns cross cultural boundaries. A seal carved in a foreign style may have belonged to a visiting merchant and administrator with international connections, or a local elite using distant imagery to enhance prestige. Ancient people were fully capable of borrowing symbols without adopting the identity of those who created them. Biological evidence adds another layer. Studies of skeletal remains can sometimes reveal differences in diet, health, ancestry, and geographic origin. Isotopic analysis of teeth may indicate whether an individual grew up in the same region where they were buried, because the chemical composition of childhood drinking water becomes locked into dental enamel. Results from Bronze Age Central Asia suggest considerable mobility across the wider region, though the available samples remain limited. Some individuals buried at major settlements likely spent their early lives elsewhere. Mobility does not always mean long-distance migration. A person raised in another part of the Murghab Delta could produce a different chemical signature without having crossed a vast cultural frontier. Seasonal herders may have moved repeatedly between oasis and steppe. Marriage networks may have transferred individuals between neighbouring settlements. Traders could spend years away from their birthplace while remaining connected to the same broader society. Ancient identity was not fixed neatly to modern borders. The fortress therefore functioned as a filter rather than a sealed barrier. Its gates controlled entry, but they did not stop movement. People arrived with animals, tools, languages, customs, and obligations. Some stayed briefly. Others built households and raised children. Over generations, what had once seemed foreign could become local. A burial custom introduced by outsiders might be absorbed into elite tradition. A new craft technique could spread through workshops. A ritual object could lose its original meaning and gain another. Not every encounter was peaceful. Wealthy oasis centers attracted raiders as well as traders. Mobile groups beyond the cultivated zone may have competed for pasture water animals and access to exchange routes. Settled populations often viewed outsiders with suspicion, especially during shortage. Fortifications and guarded gates imply that movement was not always welcomed. Some newcomers may have entered the city as captives taken during conflict, or as dependents attached to powerful households. Evidence for slavery or forced labor is difficult to identify directly. No texts record ownership, sale, or status. Yet large building projects, unequal burials, and possible sacrificial deaths raise the possibility that not everyone working at Ghana was free. Captives could have cleared canals, shaped bricks, tended animals, or served elite families. Such people would be nearly invisible archaeologically, unless buried in unusual circumstances. The grandeur of the fortress may therefore conceal lives spent under compulsion. At the same time, outsiders could be valued. Skilled metalworkers, stone carvers, healers, and ritual specialists possessed knowledge that rulers wished to attract. A migrant craftsman might receive protection and materials in exchange for service. Merchants could be granted controlled access to storerooms and elite clients. Marriage alliances with distant groups might strengthen political ties. The same society that feared strangers could depend upon them. The wider Bronze Age world was undergoing major movement. Communities expanded into new agricultural zones. Pastoral groups crossed steppe and desert corridors. Trade linked mountain mines with lowland cities. Languages and beliefs spread through networks that are only partly visible in archaeology. Ghana stood close to several of these currents. It was not merely influence from one direction, but shaped by contacts to the south, west-east, and north. This position has encouraged large theories about the identity of its inhabitants. Some researchers have linked Ghana directly to early Indo-Iranian peoples, partly because of later linguistic and religious traditions involving fire-sacred drinks, horses, and funerary customs. The idea remains influential, but the evidence does not allow a simple identification. Material culture does not map perfectly onto language, and similar rituals can be shared across groups. Ghana may have included communities speaking several languages, some ancestral to later traditions and others now completely lost. Popular accounts sometimes present the fortress as the sudden creation of a mysterious lost people who arrived from nowhere and disappeared just as abruptly. Archaeology suggests something less dramatic but more interesting. The city grew from centuries of interaction, adaptation, and movement. Its people were connected to neighboring regions long before the largest walls were built. Their culture was not pure or isolated. It was assembled through contact. Even daily life would have reflected this mixture. Markets or distribution areas may have contained unfamiliar accents and clothing. Meals could combine local grain with imported spices or new preparation methods. Children might grow up hearing stories from more than one homeland. Craftsmen could work beside people trained in different traditions. Rituals may have absorbed foreign ingredients while remaining rooted in local authority. The result was a society strong enough to turn diversity into prosperity, at least for a time. But the same connections that brought wealth also made the city dependent upon roots beyond its control. A disrupted mountain pass could reduce access to metal. Conflict in distant regions could interrupt trade. New migrations could bring competition as well as opportunity. Goner's power rested upon movement even as its walls suggested stillness, and despite all this movement, the people left no clear written account of themselves. Their goods travelled, their customs mingled, and their bodies preserved traces of distant origins, but their names remain absent. The fortress gathered strangers from across a broad world, then concealed their voices beneath mud brick and sand. To reconstruct who they were, archaeology must work without the one form of evidence that could have settled so many questions, a readable record left by the people themselves. The silence of Goner is not empty. It is crowded with traces, but none of them speak in complete sentences. A wall reveals that someone controlled access. A seal suggests ownership or authority. A grave record status. A broken vessel hints at food trade, medicine, or ritual. Yet no inscription explains the decisions behind these things. There is no surviving decree ordering the construction of the fortress, no account of a flood, no list of rulers, no prayer naming the powers worshipped inside the ceremonial compounds. The city must therefore be reconstructed from evidence that was never intended to become history. This makes Goner fundamentally different from many other Great Bronze Age centres. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets preserve contracts, taxes, letters, myths, and political disputes. In Egypt, monuments and tombs identify rulers and officials. In the Indus world, writing survives but remains undeciphered, at least providing a visible system of signs. Goner offers no comparable archive. A few marks and symbols appear on objects, but they do not form a securely understood script. Whether the inhabitants used writing on perishable materials such as wood, leather, or cloth remains unknown. If they did, the record has vanished almost completely. Archaeologists compensate by reading context. The position of an object can be as important as the object itself. A vessel found in a kitchen means something different from the same vessel placed beside a body. Ash inside a domestic hearth differs from ash layered repeatedly on a raised platform. A seal discovered near storerooms may suggest administration, while one found in a grave may represent identity or prestige. Excavation, therefore, depends upon careful recording of location, depth, association, and sequence. Once an artifact is removed without context, much of its historical value disappears. The mud brick architecture presents its own difficulty. Walls collapse into soil nearly identical to the material around them. Floors may be only thin bands of compacted earth. Doorways are blocked and reopened across generations. Rooms are reused for different purposes. A building interpreted as a palace in one phase may have become storage space in another. Excavators must distinguish subtle changes in color, texture, and construction, often under harsh conditions where wind and heat rapidly dry exposed surfaces. The fortress reveals itself slowly, and mistakes made during excavation cannot always be corrected. Chronology is equally challenging. Pottery styles, radiocarbon dates, building phases, and comparisons with neighbouring sites all help establish when Goner flourished, but exact dates remain debated. Samples can be contaminated. Old wood may produce dates earlier than the structure in which it was used. A grave dug into an older building can confuse the sequence. Different parts of the city may have been occupied at different times. As a result, the history of Goner is not a single clean line from foundation to abandonment, but a series of overlapping phases reconstructed from incomplete evidence. Human remains provide another form of testimony. Bones can reveal age, sex, injury, disease, diet, physical stress, and sometimes geographic origin. Teeth record childhood nutrition and episodes of hardship. Joint wear reflect repeated labour. Healed fractures indicate survival after injury and perhaps care from others. signs of anemia, infection, or malnutrition reveal that life inside a wealthy centre was not equally secure for everyone. Yet bones cannot identify names, occupations, emotions, or beliefs. They show what happened to bodies, not how people understood their lives. Even apparent violence demands caution. A skull injury may result from warfare accident punishment or interpersonal conflict. Burned buildings may indicate attack, but fire can also begin in a kitchen workshop or ritual space. Weapons in graves may symbolize rank rather than prove combat experience. Fortifications may suggest fear of enemies but also serve display and control. Scholars still debate how violent the history of Goner truly was because the same evidence can support several interpretations. Plant and animal remains fill in parts of the daily world. Charred seeds identify crops. Pollen and microscopic plant traces help reconstruct vegetation. Animal bones reveal diet, herding choices, hunting, sacrifice, and trade. Cut marks show butchery. Age profiles indicate whether animals were kept for meat, milk, wool, or labour. Yet preservation is uneven. A single fire may preserve one storeroom's grain while countless ordinary meals disappear. The archaeological record is shaped as much by accident as by behaviour. Residue analysis offers newer possibilities. Traces absorbed into pottery can sometimes reveal fats, oils, fermented products, or plant compounds. Isotopes can indicate diet and mobility. Ancient DNA may help explore ancestry and biological relationships. These methods have transformed the study of early societies, but they do not eliminate uncertainty. Samples are limited, contamination is possible, and scientific results still require interpretation. A chemical signature can identify a substance more easily than its cultural meaning. The absence of readable texts also affects the names used for the civilization. Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex is a modern archaeological label, built from regional geography rather than ancient identity. Oxus civilization is another modern term referring to the great river system associated with parts of Central Asia. Gonodipe itself is a modern name. None of these words tell us what the inhabitants called themselves. Their political boundaries may not have matched the distribution of their pottery or architecture. Several communities could share material traditions without belonging to one state. This uncertainty encourages both careful scholarship and imaginative speculation. The spectacular tombs, fire installations, and remote desert setting have attracted claims that Goner was the birthplace of later religions, a lost empire omitted from history, or the capital of a people described in ancient legends. Some connections may contain elements worth investigating, but the stronger claims often extend beyond the evidence. Without texts, it is tempting to fill silence with certainty. Responsible interpretation does the opposite. It keeps possibility separate from proof. What survives in the record suggests a powerful urban centre with organised labour social hierarchy, long-distance exchange, specialised crafts, and complex ritual life. That much is difficult to deny. Less certain are the names of its institutions, the language of its people, the identity of its rulers, and the beliefs that gave meaning to its ceremonies. Goner is therefore not mysterious because archaeology has discovered nothing. It is mysterious because archaeology has discovered so much without recovering the explanations that once connected it all. This absence also changes how the city's decline must be understood. There is no final chronicle describing panic in the streets, or a ruler ordering evacuation. There is no tablet recording a failed harvest, a rebellion, or the arrival of an enemy. The end must be traced through shrinking occupation, abandoned rooms, altered burials, changing trade, and the movement of water across the plain. The walls remain visible, but the force that begins to weaken the city leaves a broader and quieter mark. It appears in dry channels, shifting settlements, stressed fields, and the gradual failure of the landscape that made Ghana possible. The first signs of decline do not appear as a single disaster. There is no one preserved layer that can be pointed to as the moment Ghana dies. Instead, the foundations of the city begin to weaken through processes that are gradual, uneven, and difficult to separate from ordinary change. A canal carries less water than before. A field produces a smaller harvest. A channel fills with silt and must be cleared more often. A distant settlement is abandoned while another survives. Trade goods arrive less regularly. Repairs are postponed. Rooms once used for administration or ceremony are converted to humbler purposes. The fortress still stands, but the landscape supporting it is becoming less dependable. The Murghab River has always been unstable. Its channels spread across the delta shift direction divide and sometimes disappear into the desert. This movement created the oasis, but it also threatened every permanent settlement built within it. Ghana depended upon water reaching a particular zone through a network of natural branches and artificial canals. If the main flow migrated too far, the city could not simply command it to return. New channels might be cut, old ones deepened, and embankments rebuilt, but each intervention demanded labour and time. The larger the settlement became, the more difficult it was to move with the river. Sediment added to the problem. Water descending from the mountains carried fine material into the delta. When the river slowed across the plain, that sediment settled in channels and irrigation canals. Over years, beds rose and flow weakened. Farmers had to remove accumulated silt repeatedly. A well-maintained system could remain productive, but neglect caused rapid decline. If political authority weakened labour became harder to organise. If harvests failed, fewer workers could be fed. Environmental and social problems therefore reinforced one another. Increasing aridity may have intensified these pressures. Climate records from surrounding regions suggest that parts of Central and South Asia experienced episodes of drying during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE. These changes did not occur everywhere in exactly the same way, and scholars still debate their timing and severity in the Murghab Delta. Climate alone cannot explain the fate of every settlement, yet even a modest decline in water supply would matter greatly in a system already dependent upon unstable channels. Rainfall in the oasis itself was never the main source of agricultural water. What mattered was snow and rain in the distant highlands feeding the Murghab. A dry period hundreds of kilometres upstream could reduce flow without any obvious warning at Ghana. The inhabitants might experience the consequences long after the climatic shift began: shorter floods, weaker channels, shrinking marshes, and less water available at the end of the irrigation network. The cause remained distant, but the effects entered every field. Salinization may have created another slow threat. Irrigation water contains dissolved minerals. Under intense heat, much of that water evaporates, leaving salts behind in the soil. Without adequate drainage or periodic flushing, the concentration rises until crops struggle. Fields that once produced reliable grain become less fertile. Farmers can abandon damaged plots and open new ones, but expansion is limited by access to water. Archaeological evidence cannot always identify the exact degree of soil exhaustion around Ghana, yet the risk is inherent in long-term irrigation across arid land. The people of the oasis were not passive in the face of these changes. They had inherited generations of knowledge about canals, fields, and river movement. They could relocate intake points, deepen channels, alter crops, move herds, and establish new settlements closer to active watercourses. Some communities probably survived precisely because they remained flexible. But the monumental centre had less freedom. Its walls, storerooms, cemeteries, workshops, and ritual compounds represented enormous investments tied to one location. Abandoning them meant surrendering not only buildings but authority, memory, and sacred space. This may explain why occupation continued even as conditions became more difficult. People rarely leave a city at the first sign of decline. Families remain because their homes, fields, ancestors, and social networks are there. Elites remain because their legitimacy is connected to central buildings and rituals. Administrators attempt repairs. Farmers cultivate marginal plots. Herding becomes more important as agriculture weakens. Valuable objects are reused rather than buried or discarded. A city can persist for generations while slowly losing population and complexity. The architecture begins to reflect such pressure. Large rooms may be divided into smaller ones. Monumental spaces lose their original functions. Maintenance becomes less careful. Some compounds are abandoned while others remain occupied. The distinction between palace, temple, storeroom, and house becomes less clear as later inhabitants reuse older structures. This does not necessarily indicate immediate collapse. It may represent adaptation to a smaller population and reduced resources, but it signals that the confident order embodied in the original plan is breaking down. Food insecurity would affect society unevenly. Elite households controlling stored grain might withstand shortages longer than ordinary families. Herders could move animals toward surviving pasture, while farmers tied to failing canals faced greater risk. Labourers dependent upon centralized distribution might lose support as stores declined. Competition for water could sharpen divisions between upstream and downstream communities. A system built through cooperation could become unstable when there was no longer enough water to satisfy everyone. Conflict may have increased under such conditions, although direct evidence remains uncertain. Rival settlements could interfere with canals or claim access to active channels. Mobile groups might move closer to the oasis during dry years, bringing herds into competition with local animals. Raiding could become more attractive as agricultural surplus diminished. Fortifications that once projected strength might take on a more urgent defensive role. Yet no single enemy appears in the archaeological record, and it would be misleading to replace environmental complexity with a simple story of invasion. Trade also depended upon local stability. Caravans were more likely to visit a prosperous centre capable of offering grain-craft goods protection and reliable exchange. As production declined, Ghana's position within long-distance networks may have weakened. Reduced access to imported stone and metal would affect workshops' elite display and political authority. A ruler unable to reward followers with food or prestige goods could struggle to maintain loyalty. The city's external connections, once a source of strength, became another system vulnerable to disruption. Ritual life may have changed as well. Ceremonies centered on water, fire, fertility, or renewal would acquire greater urgency during prolonged stress. Offerings might increase. New practices could be introduced. Religious specialists might promise restoration or interpret failure as a sign of disorder. But when rituals failed to bring water back, confidence in the institutions associated with them may have weakened. This remains inference rather than direct evidence, because the sacred language of Guna is lost. The most important enemy was therefore not a single army waiting beyond the walls. It was the gradual loss of balance between population, authority, agriculture, and water. The fortress had been built to control movement, protect stores, and display power, but it could not defend the river channel that sustained everything. Mud brick towers could resist raiders. They could not stop sediment evaporation, salt, or a distant change in mountain rainfall. Eventually, the landscape began to demand a decision that no ruler could avoid. The city could continue investing labor in channels that reached less water, or its people could follow the river toward more favorable ground. Some stayed, some adapted, others left. Across the oasis, the pattern of settlement began to shift, and Gona's decline became part of a broader movement away from the great centre that had once seemed permanent. Abandonment does not arrive at Gona as a single empty morning. The city does not fall silent all at once with every gate left open and every hearth cold. Instead, departure unfolds unevenly across years and generations. One household leaves, while another remains. A workshop closes, but nearby rooms are still repaired. A ceremonial courtyard loses its original purpose and becomes storage. A once important building is occupied by people living more simply among the remains of older grandeur. The fortress does not vanish in an instant. It contracts, changes function, and slowly becomes too large for the population that still inhabits it. Across the wider Murghab Delta, settlement patterns begin to shift toward channels where water remains more reliable. Archaeological surveys reveal that communities were repeatedly established near active branches of the river, and later abandoned when those branches weakened or moved. Gona's decline fits within this larger pattern. The city had once occupied a favoured position within the oasis, but the centre of environmental opportunity was no longer fixed around it. Water was pulling life elsewhere, and the population followed in stages. For many families, relocation may have meant moving only a short distance. They could establish new fields near another canal, join relatives in a neighbouring settlement, or build modest houses beside a surviving watercourse. Such movement would not feel like the disappearance of a civilization. People carried their tools, livestock skills, customs, and memories with them. Pottery traditions continued. Ritual habits survived in altered forms. Children born in new settlements still belonged to families whose ancestors had lived beneath Gona's walls. Archaeologically, however, the great centre appears to decline while the surrounding population becomes harder to trace. Others may have travelled farther. Herders could move toward better pasture beyond the shrinking agricultural zone. Craftspeople might seek patrons in more prosperous centres to the south or east. Merchants would redirect their routes toward places still capable of supporting exchange. Elite families facing the loss of local authority may have joined related groups elsewhere, taking valuable objects, ritual knowledge, and political traditions with them. The abandonment of Gona, therefore, may have contributed to broader movements of people across Central and South Asia. The poorest inhabitants had fewer choices. Moving required animals, food tools, and social connections. A wealthy household could transport grain, possessions, and dependents. A labourer tied to failing fields might leave with almost nothing. Some people probably remained because departure was more dangerous than declining life inside the old city. They reused abandoned rooms, scavenged timber, gathered broken pottery, and cultivated whatever land still received water. Their occupation may leave only thin, confusing traces above the monumental faces archaeologists find most impressive. Objects left behind tell part of this story. Valuable metal and stone were usually carried away, recycled, or looted. What remains in abandoned rooms is often broken, heavy damaged, or forgotten. Large storage vessels may be too difficult to move. Grinding stones stay where they were used. Cracked pottery accumulates in corners. Door fittings and roof beams disappear because they can be reused elsewhere. The emptied city is gradually dismantled by its own survivors. Mud brick architecture accelerates the transformation. Without regular maintenance, roofs begin to leak during rare rains. Water cuts into walls. Wind removes exposed surfaces grain by grain. Once roofs collapse, rooms fill with debris. Upper walls fall inward, protecting lower floors beneath thick layers of earth. Termites, burrowing animals, roots, and human scavengers disturb the ruins. Within a few generations, buildings that once dominated the plain become low, irregular mounds. The cemeteries remain, but funerary practice changes. Later burials may be inserted into older structures or placed in areas once used for habitation. Such reuse suggests that the old city retained meaning even after its political and economic importance had faded. The ruins may have become ancestral ground, a place associated with memory, sacred authority, or former power. People did not necessarily understand every building's original purpose, yet the scale of the remains would have marked Gona as a place set apart. There is no evidence that the entire population was destroyed. This is important because the language of vanished civilizations can create a misleading image of sudden extinction. The people of Gona did not simply disappear from the human story. Their urban system weakened, their settlements shifted, and their cultural traditions were absorbed into later communities. Collapse describes the failure of a particular form of organization, not the end of every life associated with it. What disappears most clearly is concentration. The large population, centralized storage, monumental construction, specialized production, and long-distance exchange that supported the fortress are no longer sustained at the same scale. Skills may survive, but fewer workers are gathered in one place. Rituals continue, but without the same monumental settings. Leaders remain, but their authority may become more local. The city's complexity fragments into smaller social worlds. This fragmentation can be difficult to recognize because archaeology naturally favors large sites. Monumental walls, rich tombs, and centralized compounds are easy to identify and compare. Mobile groups, seasonal camps, and small villages leave lighter traces. When people leave an urban center and adopt more flexible ways of living, they can seem to vanish from the record, even when their descendants remain nearby. The apparent emptiness after Gona may therefore reflect a change in settlement style as much as a fall in population. The desert advances gradually into the abandoned landscape. This does not necessarily mean dunes sweep over the city in a single storm. More often, vegetation thins as irrigation ends. Dry soil breaks apart. Wind carries dust into canals and rooms. Reeds disappear from channels that no longer flow. Salt gathers on former fields. Tracks once used by carts become faint. Without human labor, the engineered oasis loses its shape and returns to the larger arid plain. Memories of the fortress may survive for generations, but they are not preserved in a form modern archaeology can recover. Stories could describe the old walls the ancestors buried there, or the time when water reached farther across the plain. Names might change as languages and populations changed. A sacred place could become a dangerous ruin. A palace might be remembered as the home of spirits. Eventually, even those stories fade. The walls collapse lower. Sand and silt cover the floors. Graves sink beyond sight. The river's active branches lie elsewhere, and travellers crossing the plain see only mounds. Gona becomes indistinguishable from the landscape that consumes it. The fortress has not been erased, only hidden, sealed beneath the material of its own decay. Yet abandonment leaves a question that environmental change alone cannot answer. Why did some communities survive while Gona lost its central role? Was the river the decisive cause, or did political conflict, migration, trade, disruption, and violence push the city past a point from which it could not recover? The empty compounds preserve the result, but not a single clear explanation. Beneath the sand, several endings remain possible. The end of Gona has attracted several explanations because the evidence resists a single dramatic answer. Climate change offers one possibility. Shifting river channels offer another. Trade disruption, social fragmentation, migration, and violence may also have played important roles. Each explanation accounts for part of the archaeological record, but none fully explains every change. The most likely story is not one cause replacing another, but several pressures arriving together and weakening the city from different directions. An invasion is the most familiar model because fortresses seem to invite military endings. Thick walls, towers, weapons, and burned buildings create an image of enemies approaching across the plain. Mobile groups from the steppe or neighbouring regions are often cast as the attackers, especially in older interpretations that explained cultural change through waves of conquest. The wider Bronze Age world did experience major population movements, and Central Asia was crossed by communities carrying new technologies, animals, and customs. Yet the evidence at Gona does not reveal one unmistakable army responsible for its abandonment. Destruction by fire appears in parts of the site, but fire alone proves little. Mud brick cities contain wooden roofs, reed mats, stored grain-fueled textiles, and workshops using open flames. Accidental fires could spread quickly through crowded compounds. Ritual burning, deliberate clearance, or later reuse can create similar layers. To identify warfare, archaeologists look for combinations of evidence, widespread destruction, occurring at the same time unburied bodies, weapons embedded in structures, sudden abandonment of valuable goods, and trauma on human remains. Gona offers hints of conflict, but not a simple final battlefield. Violence may still have shaped the decline. Competition for water could produce attacks between nearby communities. Raiding may have increased as agricultural surplus diminished. Traders and herders moving through the region might become more threatening during periods of shortage. Internal conflict is also possible. Elites controlling grain and irrigation could face resistance from households bearing the cost of failure. A fortress designed to exclude outsiders can also become a barrier separating rulers from their own population. Migration provides another explanation, but the term must be used carefully. New populations did move through Central Asia during the Bronze Age, including pastoral groups associated with steppe traditions. Their arrival may have altered trade warfare language and social organization. Horses and wheeled transport increased mobility across long distances. Communities once separated by desert and grassland became more connected. Yet migration does not always mean invasion. Newcomers can settle peacefully, intermarry trade, serve local rulers, or gradually become dominant without one decisive conquest. Some scholars connect the decline of the Oxus civilization with the spread of Indo-Iranian-speaking populations. Later religious and linguistic traditions across Iran and South Asia have encouraged attempts to identify Gona's people either as early Indo-Iranians or as communities displaced by them. Fire installations, sacred drink theories, horse burials, and certain ritual practices are often brought into the argument. But archaeology cannot assign language directly from pottery, graves, or architecture. The relationship between Gona and later Indo-Iranian cultures was likely important, yet its exact nature remains unresolved. One possibility is that the fortress population did not vanish before incoming groups, but became part of a new cultural mixture. Local farmers possessed detailed knowledge of irrigation crops and oasis survival. Mobile pastoral communities brought animals' routes and broader networks across the steppe. Interaction between them could produce new societies combining elements of both. Some traditions of Gona may have travelled south or east through these blended populations, eventually entering worlds where writing preserved only distant echoes of their origins. Trade disruption may have weakened the city before large-scale migration became decisive. Gona's elites relied on foreign materials to display status and reward loyalty. Metal, stone shell, and luxury goods connected the fortress to distant centres. If political change elsewhere interrupted those routes, workshops would lose supplies and rulers would lose prestige. A society built partly on controlling exchange can suffer when merchants choose another path. The decline of neighbouring civilizations may have amplified the problem. Across the broader region, major urban systems changed during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BCE. Settlements in the Indus world were reorganized. Political centers on the Iranian plateau rose and fell. Mesopotamian states experienced warfare and instability. Climate stress affected several regions, though not uniformly. Goner was connected to these worlds, and distant disruption could reach the Murgab through reduced demand, broken routes, or migrating populations. Disease is harder to detect but cannot be excluded. Dense settlements with livestock, stored food, and limited sanitation create conditions for infection. Malnutrition caused by poor harvests weakens resistance. Travelers introduce new pathogens. Epidemics rarely leave clear archaeological signatures unless they produce mass graves or identifiable lesions on bones. No evidence currently makes disease the main explanation for Goner's decline, but it may have contributed to population loss during periods of stress. Political fragmentation may be the most important factor and the hardest to observe. Monumental centers depend on shared belief in authority. Farmers must accept water allocations. Workers must build and repair canals. Craftsmen must trust that raw materials and food will continue to arrive. Outlying settlements must see value in supporting the center. When these relationships weaken, the system can unravel quickly. A ruler may still occupy the fortress, but without labor and surplus, the walls become empty symbols. This helps explain why environmental change alone is insufficient. Drying conditions do not automatically destroy a civilization. Communities adapt by moving fields, changing crops, reducing population, increasing herding, or relocating settlements. Collapse occurs when institutions fail to organize an effective response. Goner's leaders may have been too invested in maintaining the old center. Rival groups may have refused coordinated action. Social inequality may have made shared sacrifice impossible. The fortress that once concentrated power may have limited flexibility at the moment flexibility was most needed. At the same time, political explanations cannot ignore the river. Even the most effective administration cannot create water from nothing. Repeated engineering can prolong an irrigation system, but not indefinitely, if the main channel shifts beyond reach. The city faced both material limits and human choices. Its decline emerged from the interaction between them. What survives in the record suggests a prolonged transformation rather than one final catastrophe. Some districts weaken before others. Certain traditions continue after monumental construction declines. Population disperses rather than disappears. New influences enter the region while older practices survive. The walls lose importance, but the people carry parts of the city's culture elsewhere. This kind of ending feels less satisfying than a single invasion or disaster, because it offers no precise final day, yet it is closer to how many complex societies collapse. A drought reduces harvests, water disputes increase, elites lose credibility, trade weakens, families leave, new populations arrive, buildings are reused. The city becomes smaller, poorer, and less central until one generation no longer sees the fortress as the heart of its world. By then, Goner has not been conquered by one enemy. It has been overtaken by change itself. The city's institutions, landscape, and networks no longer support one another as they once did. Its people move into a new age while the abandoned walls remain behind, slowly sinking into the desert plain and waiting for another civilization to discover what had been lost. For centuries, the buried fortress remains almost invisible. Wind smooths the outlines of collapsed walls. Sand fills courtyards and corridors. Mud brick dissolves into the same pale earth from which it was made. Travelers crossing the plain may notice the low mound, but nothing on the surface fully reveals the scale beneath it. Gona survives not as a recognizable city, but as a slight disturbance in the desert, a raised island of debris surrounded by emptiness. Its preservation depends on this concealment. The same isolation that erases the city from memory also protects much of it from later construction. Modern archaeological attention returns to the Murghab Delta during the 20th century, when surveys begin identifying ancient settlements scattered across the desert. The region is difficult to investigate. Sites lie far from major towns. Heat dust, limited water, and the enormous scale of the plain complicate fieldwork. Ancient river channels must be traced across landscapes transformed by erosion and later irrigation. What initially appears to be a collection of minor mounds gradually resolves into the remains of a major Bronze Age settlement system. Victor Sarianidi becomes the central figure in the excavation of Gona. Working across southern Central Asia, he identifies similarities in architecture, pottery seals, metalwork and burial practices that link sites in Bactria and Margiana. At Gona, large-scale excavation exposes monumental compounds, defensive walls, cemeteries, workshops, and ritual installations. The discoveries are difficult to ignore. A region once treated as peripheral suddenly contains evidence of a complex urban society contemporary with better-known civilizations to the south and west. The excitement is understandable. Every season seems to produce another striking find: richly furnished graves, wheeled vehicles, animal sacrifices, gold ornaments, imported stones, unusual fire installations, and buildings interpreted as palaces or temples. Gona begins to appear not as a minor oasis settlement, but as the center of a civilization with its own architecture, elite traditions, religious practices, and long-distance connections. The term Oxus civilization gains wider use as scholars seek language that reflects this complexity. Yet spectacular discoveries also create interpretive risk. Archaeology rarely produces evidence as clear as the public description suggests. A room called a temple may have served several functions. A building labelled a palace may lack direct evidence of monarchy. A ritual drink cannot be reconstructed securely from ambiguous residues alone. The more extraordinary the claim, the more carefully the context must be examined. Gona therefore becomes not only an archaeological sensation, but a site of continuing debate. Sarianidi argues strongly that certain installations at Gona preserve early forms of religious traditions later associated with Iranian and Indo-Aryan cultures. Fire altars, ritual beverages, animal sacrifices, and funerary customs are interpreted as evidence of beliefs that may have contributed to later Zoroastrian or Vedic traditions. These ideas attract wide interest because they place Gona near the origin of major religious developments. They also remain controversial. Many scholars accept that broad cultural connections existed, but reject direct or overly certain identification. Part of the disagreement concerns chronology. Later religious texts were written or compiled long after Gona's principal occupation. Similar practices separated by centuries cannot automatically be treated as the same ritual system. Fire is sacred in many cultures. Plant-based ceremonial drinks appear in several traditions. Dogs, horses, water, and sacrifice can acquire symbolic importance independently. The evidence at Gona may represent ancestral practices, parallel developments, or a mixture of traditions later reorganized elsewhere. The layout of the fortress creates further debate. Some researchers emphasize centralized kingship and describe the inner complex as a royal palace. Others see a ceremonial center governed by ritual elites or powerful households rather than a single monarch. Storage rooms and controlled access support arguments for administration, but do not identify the form of government. Rich tombs demonstrate hierarchy, yet no grave can be linked to a named ruler. The city clearly possessed authority, but its exact structure remains beyond secure reconstruction. Even the scale of Goner changes as excavation progresses. Early plans focus on the central fortified area, but surrounding neighborhoods, cemeteries, water installations, and satellite settlements reveal a much broader urban landscape. The fortress was not an isolated monument standing alone in the desert. It depended upon an extended zone of fields, canals, workers' burial grounds, and smaller communities. Understanding the site therefore requires more than clearing walls. Archaeologists must reconstruct the entire delta. Remote sensing and satellite imagery have become increasingly important. Ancient channels appear as subtle variations in soil and vegetation. Aerial views reveal patterns impossible to recognize while standing on the ground. Geomorphologists trace former branches of the Murghab and compare them with settlement distribution. These studies show how closely cities followed water and how frequently occupation shifted across the plain. The buried fortress becomes part of a moving environmental system, rather than a fixed capital detached from its surroundings. Scientific analysis also reshapes earlier interpretations. Radiocarbon dating refines occupational phases. Botanical studies test claims about crops and ritual plants. Isotopes explore diet and mobility. Metallurgical analysis identifies alloy composition and possible sources of raw material. Ancient DNA may eventually clarify relationships among populations, though preservation and sampling remain difficult. Each new method adds information while also revealing how much earlier certainty rested on limited evidence. Excavation itself poses a serious challenge. Once mud brick walls are exposed, they begin to deteriorate rapidly. Wind-rain temperature change and salt damage surfaces that survived for millennia beneath the soil. Archaeologists must decide how much to uncover and how much to leave protected. Conservation requires resources that remote sites rarely possess in abundance. A discovery can therefore become a form of destruction if exposed structures are not stabilized. Looting presents another danger. Rich graves and portable objects attract illegal excavation. Once a tomb is opened without documentation, its contents may enter private collections while the context is permanently lost. A gold ornament can survive any display case, but its relationship to the body nearby vessel's animal remains, and burial sequence disappears. The object remains beautiful and historically weakened. Political boundaries and access also affect research. Goner lies within modern Turkmenistan, and archaeological work depends on permissions institutions' funding and international collaboration. Changes in policy can limit access or publication. Some excavation reports are difficult for outside scholars to evaluate, fully contributing to disagreement over interpretation. The evidence is vast but not always equally available. Despite these problems, Goner has changed the history of Bronze Age Eurasia. It demonstrates that complex urban societies flourished in Central Asia, with monumental architecture, specialized production, elite burial, and international exchange. The region can no longer be dismissed as an empty corridor between Mesopotamia, Iran, and the Indus world. It was a center in its own right, shaping and being shaped by wider networks. What remains unresolved is not whether Goner mattered, but how it mattered. Was it a capital ruling a broad territory, a ceremonial center serving several communities, a fortified hub controlling trade and irrigation, or a combination of these roles? Did its religious practices influence later traditions, or do the similarities reflect a shared cultural background too broad to assign to one site? Did environmental decline lead political collapse, or did weakened institutions make environmental change impossible to manage? The excavated walls offer no final verdict. They reveal enough to overturn old assumptions, but not enough to eliminate uncertainty. Every new trench clarifies one detail and opens another question. Gonner has returned from the desert, yet it has not returned with its voice intact. And perhaps that is why the fortress remains so powerful. It is no longer completely lost, but neither is it fully recovered. Its rooms are open to the sky. Its graves have been measured, its artifacts have been catalogued. Still, the civilization beneath the labels resists complete definition. The desert concealed Gonner for thousands of years, and even after excavation part of it remains buried in interpretation. What the desert preserves is not merely a ruined fortress, but the outline of an entire way of organizing life. Gonner's walls reveal how people turned unstable water into fields, fields into surplus into authority, and authority into monumental architecture. Its tombs reveal hierarchy, ritual, inherited status, and long-distance connection. Its workshops reveal technical skill. Its ceremonial spaces reveal attempts to give order to forces that could never be fully controlled. Taken together, these remains transform the site from an isolated curiosity into evidence of a civilization that understood both the possibilities and the dangers of living at the edge of a desert. The achievement begins with water. Without the Murghab Delta, there is no fortress, no cemetery, no palace-like compound, and no accumulation of imported wealth. Every brick in Gonner's walls ultimately depends upon irrigation. Workers must be fed. Clay must be mixed. Animals must be watered. Fields must produce enough grain to support specialists who do not cultivate their own food. The city's most impressive structures therefore rest upon an invisible foundation of canals, seasonal labour and environmental knowledge. This makes Gonner less a triumph over nature than a negotiation with it. Its inhabitants do not conquer the desert permanently. They create a temporary zone of abundance by understanding the river's behaviour and organising people around it. For centuries that arrangement succeeds. The oasis supports a population large enough to build trades specialise and bury its elites with extraordinary wealth. Yet the same system becomes fragile because it depends on continuous coordination. A neglected channel, reduced flood, or shifting river branch can damage far more than one field. The fortress expresses confidence in permanence. Thick walls suggest that the centre expects to endure. Storerooms assume future harvests. Tombs bind elite families to the land. Ceremonial compounds transform the settlement into a sacred and political centre whose importance appears larger than any individual generation. People invest in buildings that will outlive them because they believe the city will continue. That belief is familiar across history. Civilizations build as if order can be made permanent. Walls define borders. Temples promise continuity. Palaces present authority as natural and unchanging. Irrigation systems turn seasonal water into planned production. Written laws, where they exist, make social arrangements appear fixed. Gonner leaves no readable laws, but its architecture performs the same function. It converts hierarchy into space. The deepest contradiction is that the city's strength increases its vulnerability. A small community can move when water changes course. A fortified centre cannot relocate without abandoning enormous investment. The more grain stored within its walls, the more people depend upon its distribution. The more authority concentrated in the centre, the greater the consequences when that centre fails. Complexity allows Gonner to flourish, but also makes decline harder to manage. This does not mean the city was doomed from the beginning. For many generations, centralized organization may have solved more problems than it created. Coordinated labor maintained canals, stored surplus protected against short-term shortages. Fortifications discouraged raiding. Workshops produced goods unavailable to isolated villages. Rituals created shared identity among diverse communities. Long-distance trade brought materials, knowledge, and prestige. The fortress was not a mistake. It was an effective response to a demanding landscape. Its eventual decline reveals the limits of that response rather than its worthlessness. When water systems shifted, trade weakened, populations moved, and authority fragmented, the city could no longer sustain its earlier scale. The walls remained, but the relationships that gave them meaning dissolved. A fortress without workers, grain ritual, or political trust is only an arrangement of earth. The people themselves continued. This may be Goner's most important legacy. Civilizations rarely vanish in the absolute sense suggested by dramatic titles. Institutions collapse, cities are abandoned, languages change, populations disperse and mix, customs survive in altered form. Skills travel with migrants, stories are translated into new traditions. The inhabitants of Goner may have contributed to later societies across Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, and South Asia, though the precise paths remain uncertain. Some elements of their world may persist in practices whose origins are now impossible to trace. Techniques of metalworking, irrigation, animal management, burial, or ritual preparation could move across generations without preserving the name of the city where they developed. Symbols might be copied until their original meaning disappears. Sacred ideas may be reinterpreted by new languages and communities. Scholars still debate whether later Indo-Iranian traditions preserve distant echoes of the Oxus civilization, and the evidence remains too incomplete for certainty. Yet cultural influence rarely leaves a clean line. Goner also changes the way ancient Eurasia is imagined. The Bronze Age was not a collection of isolated civilizations separated by empty spaces. Between Mesopotamia, the Iranian plateau, the Indus cities, and the Eurasian steppe, stood communities that traded, migrated, competed, and created their own complex centers. Central Asia was not merely a road between more important destinations. It was a region where new cultural combinations emerged. The fortress demonstrates that urban complexity can develop in places modern observers consider unlikely. A desert plain may conceal the remains of irrigated landscapes. A low mound may contain palaces, workshops, temples, and thousands of graves. A society without readable writing may still possess sophisticated administration and far-reaching influence. Absence from traditional historical narratives does not mean absence from history, yet Goner also warns against making the past too familiar. Terms such as king, palace, temple, priest, and empire help modern audiences understand the site, but they may not correspond precisely to the institutions its inhabitants knew. The people of the fortress organized their world through concepts that are partly inaccessible. Their language, myths, political titles, and self-identity remain lost. Archaeology can reconstruct structures and patterns, but not every meaning. This uncertainty is not a failure. It is part of the truth of the site. Goner survives as both evidence and absence. The walls prove that powerful institutions existed. The graves prove that inequality and ritual shaped society. The imported goods prove connection. The dry channels prove environmental dependence. But the motives, names, and memories behind these traces remain fragmentary. Standing once more above the excavated compounds, the landscape appears empty. It takes effort to imagine the canals, fields, herds, smoke, workshops, and crowds. The fortress has returned to the colour of the plain. Wind moves through doorways without doors. Sunlight falls into rooms once hidden behind guarded passages. The city that tried to hold the desert at a distance now lies completely within it. Its legacy is not a monument that defeated time. It is a monument transformed by time. The walls endure because they collapsed. The graves survive because they were sealed. The city becomes visible to the present only after disappearing from the world that created it. Gonardepe therefore preserves more than the rise and decline of one ancient centre. It preserves the fragile bargain beneath every civilization, the belief that human order can last even when the landscape supporting it continues to change. The fortress grows quiet again as the light lowers across the plain. Shadows gather inside rooms that no longer have roofs. The outlines of walls soften, and for a moment the city seems to sink back into the earth. Nothing moves except wind carrying dust through the exposed corridors. Far beyond the ruins, the ancient channels of the Murgab remain dry, their paths visible only as faint scars across the desert. Once those channels determined where people planted, built, worshipped, and buried their dead. Water gave shape to every part of life. It gathered strangers into a city fed craftsmen and rulers, and allowed towers to rise where almost nothing stands today. Then it moved, as rivers do, indifferent to the plans made along its banks. The people followed in ways archaeology can only partly recover. Some carried animals and tools toward new water. Some remained among the weakening walls. Some entered other communities and became ancestors of people who never knew the name of Gonar. Their civilization did not end in one final scene. It thinned into movement, memory, and mixture. That may be the most honest image with which to leave the fortress. Not a city destroyed in a single night, but a place slowly released by those who could no longer remain. A doorway abandoned, a canal left uncleared, a hearth extinguished for the last time. A family looking back at walls that had once seemed permanent. Centuries passed and the fortress became a hill. The hill became part of the desert. The desert kept the rooms, tombs, vessels, and broken foundations beneath its surface until another age arrived to uncover them. Even now, Gonar does not surrender everything. Its walls reveal how people lived, but not what they called themselves. Its graves reveal belief, but not the words spoken over the dead. Its ceremonial fires survive as ash stripped of prayer. The past remains close enough to touch and too distant to fully enter. As evening settles over the Karakum, the buried fortress no longer appears as a failure. It appears as a moment when human beings created order in a difficult land and held it there for centuries. Their achievement was temporary, but temporary does not mean meaningless. Every civilization is temporary. What differs is what the earth chooses to preserve after the voices are gone. At Gonar it preserves walls beneath sand-dry channels beneath the plain, and the faint shape of a city still waiting inside the silence.